Webhooks make n8n extremely powerful. They make it easy to start workflows on external triggers like adding data to a Google Sheet. It's relatively straightforward to set up a webhook for a simple workflow. But when projects get large and there's several different webhooks that call into distinct workflows, each with different parameters, it can be really painful to manage everything. And if you're not careful how you organize everything, then it quickly becomes very difficult to make even simple changes to your systems. In this video, I'm going to be going over the do's and don'ts for working with webhooks in n8n. These tips are going to help you build workflows a lot faster and with a lot fewer bugs. They come from my experience as a senior software engineer where I've literally built hundreds of web servers in Java, Python, JavaScript, you name it. And they also come from my experience building n8n workflows both for personal use and for clients. Welcome back to Tommy Codes. Let's get into the video. I should mention that this video assumes you're already comfortable with webhooks, you've used them before, and you get the basics. If you don't know anything about webhooks and you're still very confused as to how they work at all, this probably isn't the video for you. Go watch the tutorial and come back. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's look at the sample workflow that I have on my screen here, and it is very straightforward. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to have ChatGPT output some data, and then we're going to have it write to a Google Sheet. And if we look at my Google Sheet, I don't know, I had to write the alphabet a few times. I think that's kind of funny. I don't know why. But we're going to change it up, and we're going to have ChatGPT basically output a number. And the number that's going to output is going to come from the webhook itself. All right, we've got the webhook node open. It's just a simple get webhook. Let's go ahead and test it for you guys. We're going to hit listen for test event, and then we are going to go over to my web browser and actually have the URL ready to go. And I've appended this query parameter, num times equals 5. Let's go ahead and hit that. That says workflow started. Let's see if it put it into the Google Sheet. I don't think it did. Let's go back into the webhook, and yeah, we just have to hit play here. We're going to play through all the nodes, and we're going to go back to the Google Sheet, and there's the number 5 that we provided up there. So yeah, the workflow doesn't do that much, but it works in terms of a webhook. Now, what are some issues? So what's the first don't that you guys are realizing here? What's the first don't? Well, let's take a look at the path on the webhook. We have F3755 blah, blah, blah. This is a UUID. It was randomly generated by n8n. And to be honest, it makes things a lot harder because when I look at this URL, I have literally no idea what it's doing. So the first don'ts of webhooks is do not use the default path. Do not use the default path. Modify this to something that actually makes sense, just like you would a regular web server in Python or Java or any other programming language. So we're going to change this to Tommy Codes Workflow. So we're going to change that to Tommy Codes Workflow. Let's re-listen for the event. Let's go ahead and copy this guy. We are going to put it in my browser. What did I say it was? Num times. That's 7. We're going to hit 7 there. And now the workflow is started. I think we're going to have to play it through again. That is correct. Let's play it through again. Boom, boom. And there's your 7. So that is the first don't. Do not use the default path. And the reason is for organizational purposes, you are going to get lost with this stuff. The next don't is do not use authentication when you're testing. So you'll notice I have auth sent to none. If I hit basic auth here, and let's say I add a new credential. Let's go add a new credential. Basic auth is just a username and password. So it's going to be Tommy Codes, and the password is going to be Codes. Save. And now let's go ahead and listen for the test events. And now we go over and submit this guy. And now we are prompted with a username and password. So I'm going to type in Tommy Codes, sign up or whatever, and boom, the workflow has started. So it's not that hard. Like, it's just inputting a username and password. What's the big deal? Well, if you're testing this thing over and over again, and you have to keep inputting the username and password, it's just a waste of time. And the whole point of no-code platforms like n8n is for us to be able to build cool applications faster and to give us more leverage. And a big part of actually unlocking that leverage and that speed is using the tools properly. And just like with regular software development where being able to test efficiently is going to make you much more efficient at writing the code in the first place, in n8n, if you can quickly test workflows, then you can quickly build workflows. So disable auth when testing. It's kind of like locking your door. Like, of course you lock your door when you go out for the night if nobody's home. You don't want anyone to break in. But it's inconvenient when you return to have to go and unlock your door and you can forget your keys. That's the trade-off with authentication, is it makes things safer at the expense of convenience. And when you're testing, convenience is the number one thing. So do not use authentication when you're testing. Make sure to enable it in production. And a bonus, which I will add a do that you should do, is obviously use authentication in production. If you're hosting this on the public internet and anyone in the whole world can come and hit your server, definitely use authentication. And I would actually argue you should be using IP whitelisting wherever possible. possible. IP whitelisting is more secure than just a password, because if I stole your password and I was sitting in my apartment, I could actually hack into your n8n server if I had the username and password. However, if you had IP whitelisting enabled, you could basically tell n8n, hey, not only is a password necessary, like the password has to be legit, but the request has to actually be coming from a trusted IP address. So like your apartment, your office, wherever. Another don't that I want to talk about, and this one is a little subtler and kind of tricky, but it's don't actually use a webhook trigger anywhere near business logic. Now, I know this workflow, it's kind of hard to call it business logic. It's not really doing much, but this is an example of a workflow that you would actually be building to make your business better, to build out an application, whatever. And having the webhook right here is making things a lot more difficult to deal with. So instead, what you're going to want to do is delete this guy and use the when executed by another workflow trigger, connect that, and then in here, set your parameters. Okay, go away 1Password. So what you're gonna do is, what was it, num times? Yeah, so it was num times. That was a number, and test that step, and then you're gonna go in here and just hit the little pencil, change this guy, hit save, and this is how you should set up your workflows, at least with the business logic. And the reason you wanna do that is now you don't have to worry about any of the web server processing. If you ever implemented a web server in Python or Java, you wouldn't want to put all of your web server business logic directly in the web server route handler code. This is a very straightforward Python fast API server just to showcase to you guys. And the reason I'm showing you a Python web server is I want to illustrate that webhooks really are just HTTP endpoints, and n8n, among many things, is actually just a web server. And when you're spinning up a webhook, it's not that different than just adding a route to a Python web server. It's the same concept. And just like you wouldn't put a ton of business logic directly in here, well, maybe you're guilty and you've done that, but you don't want to do that because it makes the code a lot less modular and it's way harder to share any business logic. Just like how you wouldn't want to do that in a Python web server, you also don't want to do that. You also do not want to do that in an n8n webhook flow. So instead, what you want to do is actually have a full-on API route handler workflow and forward everything to the webhook that needs it. And that's what we're looking at here. So this is a do. Do put your webhooks in some kind of API file, and do put your business logic into their own workflows. And that way you can actually call them like functions. You can test things a lot easier. And now your business logic does not need to concern itself with the details of HTTP requests, error codes, et cetera, authentication. All of that should and can happen in the top level API. So do not put a webhook trigger anywhere near business logic. On that note, I would also argue do not put webhooks in a lot of different files. It's a lot harder in n8n to organize workflows because you don't really have like this file tree like you do in PyCharm. In PyCharm, it's a lot easier to kind of see the state of the world. In n8n, like you don't really get that. You can kind of organize workflows. Like if I hit save here and I go to my personal, like there are folders. It's really just not that good, especially compared to an IDE. So you don't really want to be switching around to different files. And for that reason, I would argue put all of your webhook handling logic in a single file. And the way that you can route between different handlers or functions is actually just in this workflow directly. So if you have a GET request, maybe you could route based on the path. Or if you're doing a POST request, you can route based on the message body. Whatever you got to do, you can just do a switch statement and split things up that way. So I would not recommend having webhook triggers distributed across your n8n server. I think it's going to get very difficult to manage that. Now let's take a look at this note. It's called parsed input, and this is going to be the next don't, and that is do not consume data from the webhook node directly. Do not consume data from the webhook node directly. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the webhook, let's go ahead and, let's test this guy. What did I name it? ChatGPT alphabet workflow, sure. So we're going to go ahead and throw that in there, and then we're going to say, num times equals 7. We're going to paste that, and it's not registered. Come on, it is registered. It is registered. Okay, it was registered. I was correct. But anyway, we go over here, and you notice how there's like all this shit that has nothing to do with the parameters. This stuff is all metadata. It comes along with every HTTP request, but it's really just creating a lot of noise. It's making it harder to mock your data, and the stuff we actually care about is going to be down in the params, query, or body for the most part. So what I recommend you do is actually parse that out into a code node. So let's go ahead. I forgot. Okay, guys. Apparently, I didn't pass in the correct parameters. So let's go here, and what did we say? Num times equals 7. We're going to paste that in, and that is going to run some other code, and I'll explain what that does in a second. But let's take a look at the parsed input. We are just grabbing the params from the JSON. Actually, what we want is the query. We want the query. There it is, num times. And we are explicitly only grabbing the data that we're going to need for the business logic. And the reason that we're doing that is This stuff doesn't help us. The headers, we don't need that. It's making it harder to mock, and it's just gonna slow us down. The other reason you actually wanna parse the input is you can do validation here. You can make sure that the parameters passed in are what you expect, and then now you relieve your sub workflows of the duty of having to actually validate their input data. And that's gonna save you a lot of time in the long run. I know it looks a little silly for just the simple one here, but you don't wanna have this parsing logic and the validation logic all over the place. You want that in one place, so you have to go and change it. You know, okay, I do all my validation right here. So that's another reason why you wanna actually parse the input out. Because in the JavaScript here, you can definitely add some asserts, you could throw exceptions, literally whatever you need to do, you've got real code, and you actually want real code here. Now let's talk about how do you know when your webhooks even hit in the first place? And also, why do I have this airtable node? Let's go over into an airtable table I actually have over here. It's called webhook requests. And what we're gonna see here is I'm logging an invocation ID, also a workflow URL, and then the body params and query. And what this is literally a request log, an HTTP request log. I just happen to be using Airtable. You could use Google Sheets, you could use Postgres, like literally whatever you want. But the idea is we want to know who is calling our webhook, what parameters are they passing in, and most importantly, how can I go and view the execution? So if I go and click on this, I can actually see the full execution right there. Now I know you can just scroll through the executions in n8n, and that's fine for testing. But if you're dealing with a production system, this is gonna become a gigantic waste of time, and you're gonna wanna actually have everything logged into a table. And for that reason, the next do is log your requests into a table somewhere so you can trace what happened through your system. And in my case, I recommend Airtable. Pretty easy to do here. Whoops, I didn't mean to test that again, but you go in here. I would recommend definitely passing in the execution ID. That is an ID that is incremented every time you play any workflow on an n8n cluster. I would also recommend logging the URL of the workflow, which you can easily construct based on your domain, the workflow ID, and the execution ID. And those are all parameters that are available to you in any workflow. And I would often recommend logging the body, the params, and the query, because this just makes it a lot easier to debug if something went wrong. There are some issues with just using the executions tab in n8n. First of which, while it's running, you can't actually see what was passed into it. So if you have a really long running workflow, you're gonna have to wait until it's done or stop it to actually see the parameters that were passed in. If you log your requests to a database like Airtable, it's already right there and you can see what's going on. Maybe you need to kill it, maybe you don't. Do be careful though, because sometimes your JSON body, like you might actually be expecting a ton of data. You might be expecting megabytes of data. In those cases, I would not log that to a database because it's probably gonna use up a lot of space, be expensive, and also just be slow, especially if you're using Airtable or something that's more, I don't wanna say less serious, but it's not as heavy duty for like big data. You probably want to be careful with logging big pieces of JSON. But that being said, if you're not expecting that, and especially for params and query, you should probably be logging this stuff. And there's a lot of other stuff you could log. You could do IP addresses, you could do timestamps, like really whatever you need. And I would also recommend logging the webhook responses, which I won't show you guys an example of, but I just created the table so you guys could take a look here. Okay, the next don't return immediately. So by default, this is gonna say immediately. And if we put this to immediately and we listen for the test event, and we go over here and we make a GET request, come on. Okay, we're having some issues. That's pretty annoying. Why? Oh, that's so annoying. Okay, so I have these respond to, I'll show you guys in a second. Anyway, let's go ahead and test this workflow. And now we can go over here, and if we click test here, you'll notice that my browser returned immediately. It says workflow has started. This can work, but the issue is if I'm the user of the system and I'm not actually the person who is watching n8n and noticing what's going on in the back end, if I have no idea as a user if this actually worked or not, just knowing that it started is not giving me a lot of info. And this is basically forcing you to add some kind of external notifications, like whether it be email, Slack, whatever. The user of the system is gonna have no idea if it worked or not. So it's usually better to instead actually respond explicitly to the webhook. So that would be going over here, changing this to respond, using respond to webhook node, clicking test, and then now you'll notice when I go over here, it kind of freezes up a bit. Okay, and then it actually does pass me the data. But it took a second because it actually waited for the entire workflow to return before I got my data. And now I know this actually worked. So now I actually understand as the user that my request went through. And not only that, but I have data here that I can actually pass into a front end or make a build or build an entire micro SaaS application. This just gives you a lot more flexibility. And now we're gonna talk about respond to webhook. And specifically, we're gonna talk about the error and the success cases. So yes, you should be using respond to webhook you should not be returning immediately. And I also don't recommend returning the data itself. I do not recommend returning the raw data, and there's a few reasons for that. First of all, you do want to have different error codes and different response codes as much as possible. So that's one thing. So you definitely want to be returning a 200 if everything went okay. And if there was some kind of internal server error, generally you want to do something like a 503. And ideally you have a standardized error message format that your users or your front end or your application that's consuming the webhook response can actually interpret and help them understand what they did wrong. So that's one thing. The other thing is maybe you want to validate some of the output. And again, you're going to want to do that here, not within the sub workflow directly. And if that happens, you're definitely going to want to put it before the respond to webhook node. Returning the errors is really important. Your users are going to actually understand if they broke something and what they need to do differently to fix it. And also, it makes it so much easier to turn just a random collection of n8n workflows into a fully fledged SaaS or application, like a full-on web app. And you can do this with vibe coding. You can connect lovable.dev or v0. You can vibe code your front end. And if you did a good job of setting up your back end and you're returning errors and returning data properly, again, just like you would in a Python web server, if you're thoughtful about that, then you're basically able to one-shot a front end for these n8n workflows because you are, as a back-end developer, providing enough information to actually have a good user experience. So it really is super important. And I know it's kind of a pain in the ass to do this if you're just building like a one-off workflow. You just need to get something out quick. But these types of things can really make your life a lot easier. Now, again, I'm recommending putting all of your webhook logic into this single file, this single workflow. And in the instance of logging, in the instance of server logging, what's really good about this setup is I actually don't need to rewrite the request logging logic anywhere else. If I add new sub workflows that I want to call, I do have to add some routing, but the logging is already handled. I mentioned the response logging. Maybe you don't need to log the actual responses if things were okay, but if you got an error, you almost certainly want to have that logged into your Airtable, Google Sheets, wherever, because that is going to make debugging so much easier if you actually have access to that stuff and you don't need to just be combing through the executions here, because weird stuff happens with n8n. It's not really a database, and I wouldn't treat it as such. I hope you guys found this helpful. I hope these tips can help you work faster, deal with fewer headaches, and just build more airtight production systems. Let me know in the comments if you learned something. Let me know if you want me to talk about more n8n software engineering topics, and we'll see you next time on Tommy Codes. Thanks for watching.